What if I told you that the most powerful leadership stance isn't about being invulnerable, but about finding your strong ground? That athletic stance that allows you to stay grounded while remaining agile enough to respond to whatever comes your way. Today, we're diving deep into strong ground, the lessons of daring leadership, the tenacity of paradox, and the wisdom of the human spirit by Brené Brown, a book that represents the culmination of 6 years of global leadership work with over 150,000 leaders across 45 countries. Brené Brown is a research professor at the University of Houston and one of the world's leading experts on courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. Her TED Talk on vulnerability has been viewed over 60 million times, and her previous books, including Daring Greatly and Dare to Lead, have transformed how we think about leadership and human connection. In Strong Ground, she reveals the essential mindsets and skill sets that today's leaders desperately need to navigate our increasingly complex and uncertain world. If you're feeling overwhelmed by the pace of change, struggling with the pressure to have all the answers, or finding it difficult to lead with authenticity in a world that often rewards performance over genuine connection, then these next few minutes contain the roadmap to reclaiming your power and leading from a place of both strength and heart. The truth is that traditional leadership approaches, built on control, certainty, and emotional armor, are not only outdated but actively harmful in our current reality. This isn't about becoming a softer leader or abandoning accountability. It's about developing the courage to lead with both vulnerability and strength, embracing paradox as a superpower, and cultivating what Brown calls grounded confidence that allows you to stay connected to your values while adapting to rapid change. Strong Ground isn't just another leadership book. It's a playbook for anyone who wants to lead with courage, build trust through uncertainty, and create cultures where people can thrive rather than merely survive. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Strong Ground: Understanding Paradox as Power. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown explains that the most critical skill for modern leaders isn't the ability to have all the answers. It's the capacity to hold paradox. After working with over 150,000 leaders across 45 countries through her Dare to Lead program, Brown discovered that those who thrived in uncertainty were those who could embrace seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. Brown's research over 2 decades studying courage, vulnerability, and shame revealed a fundamental challenge. Most of us are wired to seek certainty and avoid the discomfort of not knowing. We want clear answers, definitive strategies, and predictable outcomes. But Brown's breakthrough insight challenges this conventional wisdom entirely. The leaders who are most effective in today's volatile world are those who have learned what she calls negative capability, the ability to remain present and curious in uncertainty and doubt, without irritably reaching after fact and reason. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive research with global leaders. 78% of the most successful transformation efforts she studied involved leaders who could simultaneously hold competing priorities without choosing sides prematurely. This challenges the common belief that good leadership requires decisive, black and white thinking. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that the most powerful leaders are those who can sit with complexity long enough to find innovative solutions that honor multiple truths. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, the courage to stay curious and connected in the face of uncertainty is not a luxury. It's a necessity for anyone who wants to lead meaningful change. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of Maria, a CEO who was facing pressure from her board to either completely embrace remote work or return everyone to the office full-time. The board wanted a clear decision, and employees were divided. Traditional leadership thinking would have demanded she pick a side and defend it. Instead, Maria applied Brown's paradox framework. She acknowledged the legitimate concerns on both sides: productivity and connection for remote advocates, culture and collaboration for in-office supporters, and refused to collapse into either-or thinking. Over several months, Maria led her team through what Brown calls productive discomfort, creating space for both perspectives to be fully explored. The result wasn't a compromise that satisfied no one, but an innovative hybrid model that actually enhanced both productivity and culture. Employee engagement scores increased by 35%, and the company saw its highest retention rates in 5 years. This wasn't luck. It was the application of Brown's paradox methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests starting with what she calls the both and practice. When you encounter a situation that seems to demand choosing between two important values or priorities, resist the urge to immediately pick a side. Instead, ask yourself, what if both things could be true? What if this tension is actually pointing toward a more creative solution? The key is learning to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing while staying engaged with the problem. Brown warns against what she calls either or thinking armor, the tendency to oversimplify complex situations because uncertainty feels too vulnerable. Instead, focus on building your capacity to remain curious rather than defensive when faced with paradox. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the Paradox Journal, spending 5 minutes each day noting situations where you felt pressured to choose sides, then exploring what might be possible if you held space for multiple truths. The deeper truth here is that paradox isn't a problem to be solved. It's a doorway to innovation and growth. When you develop the courage to stay present with competing truths, you don't just become a better leader. You model for others that it's safe to bring their full complexity to work. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites but dance partners. People who master this principle experience what researchers call cognitive complexity, the ability to see multiple perspectives simultaneously, which leads to better decision-making, stronger relationships, and more innovative solutions. As the research in Strong Ground shows, teams led by paradox-comfortable leaders are 40% more likely to generate breakthrough innovations. Your action step from this chapter: identify one current situation where you feel pressured to make an either-or choice. Instead of deciding immediately, spend this week asking, what if both perspectives have merit? Notice how this shift changes your approach to the problem. This simple practice develops what Brown calls your paradox muscle, leading to more nuanced and effective leadership decisions. Chapter 2, Grounded Confidence, the Athletic Stance of Leadership. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown reveals that true leadership confidence isn't about projecting invulnerability. It's about developing what she calls grounded confidence, which she describes using the metaphor of an athletic stance. After analyzing thousands of interviews with leaders who maintained their effectiveness during crisis and change, Brown identified a critical distinction between what she calls armored confidence and grounded confidence. Brown's research, spanning over 2 decades and including data from her work with 150,000 leaders globally, uncovered a surprising pattern. The leaders who appeared most confident on the surface often crumbled under pressure, while those who embraced what seemed like contradictions, strength with humility, certainty with curiosity, remained steady through turbulence. The problem most people face is confusing confidence with bravado or mistaking vulnerability for weakness. But Brown's research shows that sustainable confidence actually requires the courage to say, "I don't know," when you don't know, while simultaneously maintaining your capacity to lead through uncertainty. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive fieldwork with leaders across industries. Authentic confidence operates like an athletic stance in sports, feet planted firmly, but ready to move in any direction, knees slightly bent to absorb impact, centered but not rigid. This challenges the common belief that leadership confidence means having all the answers and never showing doubt. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that grounded confidence comes from knowing your values, owning your story, and staying curious about what you don't know. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, grounded confidence isn't about being right. It's about being real, staying connected to your values, and having the courage to learn in real time. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of James, a manufacturing plant manager who was promoted during a major safety crisis that had shut down production. His predecessor had tried to project certainty, making promises about timelines that couldn't be kept and refusing to acknowledge the complexity of the situation. Employee trust was at an all-time low, and the corporate office was demanding immediate answers. Instead of falling into the same pattern, James applied Brown's grounded confidence framework. At his first all-hands meeting, James did something radical. He said, "I don't have all the answers yet, but here's what I do know. Our values around safety are non-negotiable. We're going to figure this out together, and I'm going to be transparent with you throughout this process." He then outlined the investigation process, acknowledged the legitimate concerns of both workers and management, and committed to weekly updates regardless of whether he had good news to share. The result was remarkable. Employee engagement scores improved even while the plant was closed, and when production resumed 3 months later, they achieved the highest safety ratings in the company's history. This wasn't luck, it was the application of Brown's grounded confidence methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests developing what she calls the values courage action framework. First, get crystal clear on your core values, not what you think you should value, but what actually guides your decisions when no one is watching. Second, practice courage over comfort by choosing growth and truth-telling even when it feels vulnerable. Third, align your actions with your values even when it's difficult. The key is understanding that grounded confidence comes from internal alignment, not external validation. Brown warns against what she calls performative confidence, the exhausting practice of projecting certainty you don't feel while disconnecting from your authentic experience. Instead, focus on building what she calls internal credibility, the deep trust that comes from knowing you'll honor your values and learn from your mistakes. One practical tool from strong ground is the daily alignment check, ending each day by asking yourself, where did I choose courage over comfort today? Where did my actions align with my values? What did I learn about myself? The deeper truth here is that grounded confidence isn't about being fearless. It's about feeling the fear and choosing to stay connected to your values and your people anyway. When you develop this kind of authentic confidence, you don't just become more effective, you become more trustworthy, which is the foundation of all meaningful influence. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that vulnerability and courage are the same thing measured differently. People who master grounded confidence experience what researchers call authentic leadership presence, the ability to remain centered and connected even under pressure, which creates psychological safety for their teams. As the research in Strong Ground shows, leaders with high grounded confidence scores have teams with 50% higher trust levels and 35% better performance during challenging periods. Your action step from this chapter: practice the values courage action check for the next week. Each morning, identify one way you can choose courage over comfort that day. Each evening, reflect on how your actions aligned with your stated values. Notice how this practice affects both your confidence and your relationships. This simple routine builds the internal foundation of grounded confidence that Brown identifies as essential for sustainable leadership. Chapter 3. The Courage to be Curious, Leading Through Questions, Not Answers. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown explains that one of the most powerful shifts leaders can make is moving from being the knower to being the learner. Through her work with over 150,000 leaders across 45 countries, Brown discovered that the most effective leaders weren't those with the most answers, but those with the best questions and the courage to stay curious even when curiosity felt uncomfortable or risky. Brown's research over 2 decades revealed a fundamental challenge in leadership culture. We've been conditioned to believe that leadership means having answers, making quick decisions, and projecting certainty. The problem most people face is that this approach worked in a more predictable world, but it's actually counterproductive in our current reality of rapid change and complex challenges. But Brown's breakthrough insight turns this assumption upside down. Her research with global leaders shows that curiosity, not certainty, is the leadership superpower of our time. Teams led by curious leaders are 67% more likely to navigate change successfully and 45% more innovative than teams led by answer-focused leaders. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive research. The leaders who thrived during the most challenging periods were those who had developed what she calls courageous curiosity, the willingness to ask questions that might reveal their own limitations, challenge existing assumptions, and open up new possibilities even when doing so felt vulnerable. This challenges the common belief that good leadership requires having solutions before problems are fully understood. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that the most powerful leaders are those who can ask the questions others are afraid to ask. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, curiosity requires courage because it means risking the discovery that what we thought we knew might be wrong, and that's exactly where breakthrough happens. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of Dr. Sarah Chen, who was brought in to lead a struggling hospital department where patient satisfaction scores were declining and staff turnover was at an all-time high. The previous leadership had focused on implementing new protocols and efficiency measures, but problems persisted. Instead of immediately proposing solutions, Dr. Chen spent her first month doing what Brown calls curiosity rounds, asking questions rather than giving directives. She asked nurses, What would have to change for you to feel excited about coming to work? She asked patients. Tell me about a time when you felt truly cared for in a healthcare setting. She asked doctors. What's getting in the way of you providing the level of care you want to provide? The questions revealed that the real issues weren't about protocols or efficiency. They were about connection, meaning, and the staff feeling heard and valued. Based on these insights, Dr. Chen implemented changes that addressed the root causes rather than just symptoms. Within 6 months, patient satisfaction scores increased by 40%, and staff retention improved dramatically. This wasn't luck, it was the application of Brown's curiosity-driven leadership approach. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests developing what she calls the question-first protocol. When faced with a challenge or opportunity, resist the urge to immediately jump to solutions. Instead, spend time crafting what Brown calls generative questions, questions designed to open up possibilities rather than narrow them down. The key is learning to see questions not as signs of weakness or uncertainty, but as tools for discovery and innovation. Brown warns against what she calls solution addiction, the compulsive need to have answers immediately, even when the problem isn't fully understood. Instead, focus on building your tolerance for the discomfort that comes with not knowing while staying actively engaged in learning. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the 5-question framework. Before proposing any solution, ask yourself, 1. What don't I know about this situation? 2. Whose perspectives am I missing? 3. What assumptions am I making? 4. What would success look like for everyone involved? 5. What question, if answered, would change everything? The deeper truth here is that curiosity isn't just about gathering information. It's about modeling intellectual humility and creating psychological safety for others to share what they really think and feel. When you lead with questions rather than answers, you don't just make better decisions, you build stronger relationships and more engaged teams. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that leadership is ultimately about connection, and connection requires genuine interest in others' experiences and perspectives. People who master curious leadership experience what researchers call learning agility, the ability to quickly adapt and grow from new experiences, which is increasingly recognized as the most important leadership competency for the 21st century. As the research in Strong Ground shows, teams with curious leaders report 60% higher psychological safety scores and generate 3x more innovative ideas. Your action step from this chapter. For the next week, practice the question-first protocol. In every meeting or significant conversation, commit to asking at least 2 genuine questions before offering any opinions or solutions. Focus on questions that help you understand others' perspectives and experiences. Notice how this shift affects both the quality of information you receive and the quality of your relationships. This practice develops what Brown calls your curiosity muscle, leading to more effective leadership and deeper connections with your team. Chapter 4, Above the Line Leadership, Choosing Growth Over Self-Protection. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown introduces one of her most powerful frameworks, the above-below-the-line practice. Through her work with over 150,000 leaders globally, Brown discovered that in any given moment we're either operating above the line, from curiosity, learning, and growth, or below the line, from self-protection, defensiveness, and closed-mindedness. The difference between these two states determines not just our effectiveness as leaders, but our ability to create cultures where people can thrive. Brown's research over 2 decades studying courage and vulnerability revealed a critical pattern. The most resilient leaders weren't those who never experienced fear, frustration, or failure. They were those who had developed the capacity to recognize when they were operating from a defensive posture and consciously choose to move back into learning mode. The problem most people face is that our brains are wired to protect us from perceived threats, which means we often default to below-the-line behaviors like blame, shame, and avoidance when we feel challenged or uncertain. But Brown's breakthrough insight shows us that we can actually train ourselves to notice these patterns and make different choices. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive fieldwork. Leaders who consistently operate above the line create what she calls learning cultures, where psychological safety is high, innovation thrives, and people feel empowered to take risks and share ideas. Conversely, leaders who spend most of their time below the line, even if they're technically competent, create cultures of fear, blame, and stagnation. This challenges the common belief that leadership effectiveness is primarily about strategic thinking or technical skills. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that the most important leadership skill is emotional and relational awareness, the ability to recognize your internal state and choose responses that serve the larger purpose rather than just protect your ego. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, the most powerful question a leader can ask isn't, "What should we do?" It's, "Where am I right now, and where do I need to be to serve this situation?" Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of Marcus, a technology director whose team was struggling with a major software implementation that was behind schedule and over budget. The pressure from senior leadership was intense, and team morale was plummeting. Marcus's initial response was classic below-the-line behavior. He blamed the vendor, criticized team members for not working harder, and became increasingly controlling about every detail of the project. Everything changed when Marcus learned about Brown's above-below-the-line framework during a leadership development session. He realized he was operating from fear and self-protection rather than curiosity and learning. Marcus called a team meeting and did something radical. He acknowledged that his leadership approach had been part of the problem. He asked the team what they needed from him to be successful, and he committed to approaching challenges from above the line going forward. The shift in team dynamics was immediate. Within 2 weeks, the team had identified creative solutions to 3 major technical hurdles. The project was completed only 1 month behind the original timeline, and team members later said it became one of their most satisfying professional experiences despite the challenges. This wasn't luck. It was the application of Brown's above-below-the-line methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests developing what she calls locating yourself practice. Throughout the day, pause and ask yourself, "Where am I right now? Am I operating from curiosity or self-protection? Am I focused on learning and growth, or am I trying to prove I'm right and others are wrong?" The key is developing the awareness to catch yourself when you slip below the line and the skill to consciously choose to move back above it. Brown warns against what she calls righteousness addiction, the intoxicating feeling of being right, which keeps us below the line even when it's not serving us or others. Instead, focus on what she calls conscious leadership, making intentional choices about your internal state based on what the situation requires rather than what feels most comfortable or familiar. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the above-below-the-line check-in. Several times a day, rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 for curiosity, openness, and learning orientation. When you notice you're below a 6, take 3 deep breaths and ask yourself, what would it look like to approach this situation from above the line? The deeper truth here is that above-the-line leadership isn't about being positive all the time. It's about being conscious and intentional about your responses to challenges. When you develop the capacity to stay in learning mode even during difficult situations, you don't just become more effective. You model for others that it's possible to remain curious and growth-oriented even under pressure. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that leadership is ultimately about creating the conditions for others to do their best work. People who master above-the-line leadership experience what researchers call adaptive capacity, the ability to adjust and thrive in changing circumstances while helping others do the same. As the research in Strong Ground shows, teams with leaders who consistently operate above the line report 45% higher engagement scores and are 3x more likely to meet their goals during challenging periods. Your action step from this chapter: practice the above-below-the-line check-in for the next week. Set 3 reminders on your phone to pause and assess whether you're operating from curiosity or self-protection. When you catch yourself below the line, take 3 deep breaths and ask, what would curiosity and learning look like right now? Notice how this awareness affects both your internal experience and your interactions with others. This practice builds what Brown calls your conscious leadership muscle, leading to more intentional and effective responses to challenges. Chapter 5. The Power of Pocket Presence, Micro-Moments of Connection. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown reveals one of her most practical and transformative concepts: pocket presence. Through her research with over 150,000 leaders across 45 countries, Brown discovered that leadership isn't primarily about grand gestures or major speeches. It's about the accumulation of small, intentional moments of connection and authenticity that happen throughout each day. These micro-moments, when practiced consistently, create profound shifts in culture, trust, and performance. Brown's research over 2 decades studying human connection revealed a surprising insight. People don't remember leaders for their strategic brilliance or technical expertise nearly as much as they remember how those leaders made them feel in everyday interactions. The problem most people face is believing that leadership impact comes from big moments, the presentations, the decisions, the crises, while overlooking the dozens of small interactions that actually shape culture and relationships. But Brown's breakthrough insight shows that the most influential leaders are those who understand what she calls the compound effect of microconnections. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive field studies. Leaders who master pocket presence, the ability to be fully present and authentically connected in brief interactions, create exponentially higher levels of trust, engagement, and psychological safety than leaders who save their leadership energy for what they consider more important moments. This challenges the common belief that leadership is primarily about formal authority and structured interactions. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that the most powerful leadership happens in the hallways, the elevator conversations, the 2-minute check-ins, and the brief moments between meetings. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, pocket presence is about bringing your full attention and authentic self to the small moments, because those small moments are where trust is built or eroded, one interaction at a time. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of Alina, a busy executive director of a nonprofit who was struggling with team cohesion and communication issues. Despite having regular team meetings, one-on-ones, and strategic planning sessions, something was missing. The formal structures were in place, but the culture felt disconnected and transactional. Alina learned about pocket presence during a leadership retreat and decided to experiment with it. She started with simple changes. Instead of checking her phone while walking to meetings, she made eye contact and had brief, genuine conversations with people she passed. Instead of rushing through routine interactions, she paused to really listen when someone shared something personal. She began leaving her office door open and inviting people to share what was really happening for them, not just work updates. Within 6 weeks, the organizational climate survey showed marked improvements in trust and communication scores. Team members started collaborating more spontaneously, bringing creative ideas forward and supporting each other through challenges. The transformation wasn't the result of any major policy change. It was the accumulation of hundreds of moments where Alina showed up as fully present and genuinely interested in her people. This wasn't luck. It was the application of Brown's pocket presence methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests developing what she calls intentional microconnections. This means approaching routine interactions, greeting colleagues, riding in elevators, grabbing coffee, passing in hallways, as opportunities for genuine connection rather than just social obligations to get through. The key is bringing what Brown calls generous attention to these moments, being fully present, making eye contact, and showing genuine interest in the person in front of you. Brown warns against what she calls efficiency addiction, the belief that every interaction needs to be optimized for productivity rather than connection. She also cautions against presence performance, going through the motions of connection without genuine curiosity or care. Instead, focus on what she calls authentic availability, being genuinely open to seeing and being seen by others, even in brief encounters. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the 3-breath reset. Before any interaction, take 3 conscious breaths and set an intention to be fully present with whoever you're about to encounter. The deeper truth here is that pocket presence isn't about being on all the time or performing connection. It's about recognizing that every interaction is an opportunity to either build or erode trust, to either contribute to psychological safety or undermine it. When you develop the capacity to bring authentic presence to small moments, you don't just improve your relationships, you model for others that they matter, that their experience is seen and valued. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that leadership is ultimately about creating cultures where people can be authentic and do their best work. People who master pocket presence experience what researchers call relational intelligence, the ability to build trust and influence through consistent, authentic connections rather than formal authority. As the research in Strong Ground shows, leaders who practice pocket presence have teams with 50% higher retention rates and 40% better collaboration scores. Your action step from this chapter. For the next week, practice the 3-breath reset before every significant interaction. Choose 3 routine daily interactions, perhaps greeting your team in the morning, chatting with a security guard, or checking in with a colleague, and commit to being fully present in those moments. Put away devices, make eye contact, and show genuine interest in the person in front of you. Notice how these micro moments of connection affect both your relationships and your overall sense of fulfillment at work. This practice builds what Brown calls your presence muscle, leading to stronger relationships and more authentic influence. Chapter 6. Lock in and lock through power, sustaining courage under pressure. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown introduces a crucial concept that separates effective leaders from those who burn out or compromise their values under pressure. Lock in and lock through power. Through her work with over 150,000 leaders globally, Brown discovered that sustainable leadership isn't about having endless energy or being naturally resilient. It's about developing specific practices that help you stay connected to your values and maintain your capacity for courageous action even when the stakes are high and the pressure is intense. Brown's research over 2 decades studying courage and resilience revealed a critical insight. Most leaders have what she calls situational courage. They can be brave when conditions are favorable, when they feel supported, or when the risks seem manageable. But the leaders who create lasting positive change are those who have developed what Brown terms structural courage, the ability to access their values and maintain their integrity even under extreme pressure. The problem most people face is that courage isn't a personality trait or a one-time decision. It's a practice that requires specific skills and systems to sustain over time. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive research. Leaders who maintained their effectiveness during the most challenging periods had developed 2 crucial capacities. Lock-in power is the ability to anchor yourself to your core values and purpose when everything around you feels chaotic or uncertain. Lock-through power is the capacity to persist in courageous action even when the initial enthusiasm wanes, when obstacles mount, or when others lose faith in the vision. This challenges the common belief that courage is about fearlessness or natural confidence. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that sustainable courage is actually about having reliable systems for reconnecting with what matters most when your emotional resources are depleted. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, courage isn't the absence of fear, it's feeling the fear and having practices that help you choose growth over safety anyway. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of David, a school principal who took on a struggling urban school where test scores were low, teacher turnover was high, and community trust had been eroded by years of broken promises from previous administrations. David knew that meaningful change would take years, and that he'd face constant pressure from the district office, parents, and even some teachers who had given up hope. David applied Brown's lock-in and lock-through framework by first getting crystal clear on his non-negotiable values. Every child deserves excellent education, relationships are the foundation of learning, and sustainable change requires involving the entire community. He created what Brown calls value anchors, specific practices for reconnecting with these principles during difficult moments. When he felt overwhelmed by bureaucracy, he spent lunch periods reading with struggling students. When he faced criticism from district officials, he reminded himself that his primary accountability was to the children and families he served. When teachers expressed frustration with slow progress, he organized story circles where they shared examples of individual student growth that might not show up in test scores. Over 3 years, the school's academic performance improved dramatically, but more importantly, it became a place where both students and teachers wanted to be. This wasn't luck. It was the application of Brown's lock-in and lock-through methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests developing what she calls a courage maintenance system, specific practices for sustaining your commitment to growth and authenticity over time. Lock-in power requires identifying your core values and creating regular practices for reconnecting with them. Lock-through power requires building your capacity to persist even when progress feels slow or when others lose enthusiasm for the work. The key is recognizing that courage isn't about feeling brave. It's about having reliable ways to choose values-aligned action even when you don't feel brave. Brown warns against what she calls courage bankruptcy, depleting your emotional resources by trying to sustain courage through willpower alone without building systems to support your resilience. She also cautions against values drift, gradually compromising your principles under pressure without conscious choice. Instead, focus on what she calls structural support for courage, creating environmental and relational conditions that make it easier to be brave. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the daily values check. Each morning, identify one specific way you'll honor your core values that day, regardless of what challenges arise. Each evening, reflect on where you stayed true to your values and where you might have compromised them. The deeper truth here is that lock-in and lock-through power aren't about being perfect or never experiencing doubt. They're about having reliable ways to return to your center when you get knocked off course. When you develop these capacities, you don't just become more consistent in your leadership. You become more trustworthy, because people can count on you to stay connected to your values even under pressure. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that sustainable change requires what she calls durable courage, the ability to maintain your commitment to growth and authenticity over the long term rather than just in inspiring moments. People who master lock-in and lock-through power experience what researchers call moral resilience, the ability to maintain ethical behavior and value-driven action even in challenging environments. As the research in Strong Ground shows, leaders with high lock-in and lock-through power have 60% better retention rates in their roles and are 3x more likely to successfully implement long-term organizational changes. Your action step from this chapter: create your own courage maintenance system this week. First, identify your top 3 non-negotiable values. Then for each value, create one specific daily practice that helps you stay connected to it, your lock-in power. Finally, identify one weekly practice that helps you persist in value-driven action even when it's difficult, your lock-through power. For example, if authentic connection is a core value, your daily practice might be having one genuine conversation each day, and your weekly practice might be reflecting on where you chose authenticity over performance. Notice how having these systems affects your ability to stay true to yourself under pressure. Chapter 7. The Anatomy of Transformation Leading Change That Lasts. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown reveals the hidden architecture of sustainable change through what she calls the anatomy of transformation. After working with over 150,000 leaders across 45 countries, Brown discovered that most change efforts fail not because of poor strategy or insufficient resources, but because leaders don't understand the emotional and relational dynamics that determine whether transformation takes root or gets rejected by the system. Brown's research over 2 decades studying organizational change and human behavior revealed a crucial gap between what most leaders think drives transformation and what actually creates lasting change. The problem most people face is approaching change primarily as a technical challenge, focusing on new processes, systems, and structures while underestimating the human elements that determine success or failure. But Brown's breakthrough insight shows that sustainable transformation requires what she calls adaptive change, shifting not just what people do, but how they think, feel, and relate to each other and the work itself. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive fieldwork with organizations undergoing major transitions. Successful transformation happens in 3 distinct but interconnected phases that she calls the anatomy of transformation. First is disruption, the period when old ways of operating are no longer effective, creating discomfort that motivates change. Second is integration, the messy middle phase where new behaviors and mindsets are practiced, refined, and gradually adopted. Third is emergence, when new ways of being become natural and sustainable, creating the foundation for continued growth. This challenges the common belief that change is primarily about implementing new procedures or policies. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that transformation is fundamentally about helping people navigate the emotional journey from who they were to who they're becoming. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, change is an event, but transformation is a process that honors both the difficulty of letting go and the courage required to step into something new. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of a healthcare organization that was implementing a major shift from traditional hierarchical care models to team-based, patient-centered care. The technical aspects were well planned: new workflows, updated technology systems, revised job descriptions. But 6 months into the implementation, resistance was high, stress levels were through the roof, and patient satisfaction scores were actually declining. The breakthrough came when the leadership team learned about Brown's anatomy of transformation framework and realized they had focused entirely on the technical changes while ignoring the adaptive challenges. They began addressing the disruption phase by acknowledging that the changes required people to let go of professional identities and ways of working that had served them for decades. They supported the integration phase by creating learning labs, where staff could experiment with new approaches in low-stakes environments and share both successes and failures openly. They fostered emergence by celebrating examples of the new culture in action and helping people see how the changes aligned with their deeper purpose of serving patients. Within a year, the transformation that had seemed to be failing became one of the most successful change initiatives in the organization's history, with both staff engagement and patient outcomes reaching record highs. This wasn't luck. It was the application of Brown's transformation methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests approaching any significant change, personal or professional, by consciously attending to all three phases of transformation. During disruption, practice what she calls productive discomfort, acknowledging the difficulty of change while staying connected to the purpose driving it. During integration, focus on what she calls learning over knowing, treating setbacks and mistakes as information rather than failures. During emergence, celebrate small wins and help others see how new behaviors are creating the outcomes everyone wants. The key is understanding that transformation is not linear, and that each phase requires different kinds of support and leadership. Brown warns against what she calls change impatience, the tendency to rush through the emotional and relational work of transformation because it feels inefficient or too soft. She also cautions against implementation tunnel vision, focusing so intensely on executing new procedures that you miss the human dynamics that determine whether people will actually adopt them. Instead, focus on what she calls adaptive leadership, helping people build the capacity to navigate change rather than just comply with new requirements. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the transformation temperature check, regularly asking yourself and your team 3 questions. 1. What are we having trouble letting go of? 2. What new skills or mindsets are we still developing? 3. Where are we seeing evidence that the change is becoming natural? The deeper truth here is that the anatomy of transformation isn't just about organizational change. It's about recognizing that all meaningful growth requires us to move through cycles of disruption, integration, and emergence. When you develop the capacity to lead yourself and others through these phases with compassion and skill, you don't just implement successful changes, you build cultures that can adapt and thrive in an ever-changing world. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that leadership is ultimately about helping people develop their own capacity for courage, connection, and resilience. People who master transformation leadership experience what researchers call change agility, the ability to not just survive change, but to use it as a catalyst for growth and innovation. As the research in Strong Ground shows, organizations led by transformation-savvy leaders are 70% more successful at implementing major changes and have 45% higher employee engagement during transition periods. Your action step from this chapter. Identify one significant change happening in your life or organization right now. Use the transformation temperature check to assess where you are in the process. What old patterns or ways of being are you having trouble releasing? What new skills or approaches are you still developing? Where are you seeing signs that the new way is becoming natural? Based on this assessment, choose one specific action to support whichever phase needs the most attention. Notice how this framework helps you approach change with more patience and strategic focus. Chapter 8, Mission Clarity over Mission Critical, Leading with Purpose. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown challenges one of the most overused phrases in organizational life, mission critical. Through her work with over 150,000 leaders across 45 countries, Brown discovered that most organizations and teams spend enormous energy labeling things as mission critical, while lacking genuine clarity about what their mission actually is and why it matters. This confusion creates cultures of perpetual urgency without clear direction, leaving people exhausted and disconnected from meaningful purpose. Brown's research over 2 decades studying organizational culture and human motivation revealed a startling pattern. The organizations with the highest performance and engagement weren't those with the most sophisticated strategic plans or the most ambitious goals. They were those with the deepest clarity about their purpose and the strongest connection between individual roles and collective mission. The problem most people face is treating mission and values as abstract concepts to put on websites and posters rather than as living principles that guide daily decisions and priorities. But Brown's breakthrough insight shows that mission clarity, the ability to articulate and embody why the work matters, is the foundation of both individual fulfillment and organizational effectiveness. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive research with high-performing teams. When people have genuine clarity about how their work contributes to something meaningful beyond themselves, they demonstrate what she calls purpose-driven resilience, the capacity to persist through challenges, adapt to change, and maintain high standards even under pressure. This challenges the common belief that motivation comes primarily from external rewards like compensation, recognition, or advancement opportunities. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that the most sustainable motivation comes from what she calls values-purpose alignment. The deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your daily work is connected to your core values and contributes to something you genuinely care about. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, mission critical is about urgency, but mission clarity is about meaning, and meaning is what sustains people through the inevitable challenges of doing anything worthwhile. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of a technology company that was struggling with employee burnout and high turnover despite offering competitive salaries and benefits. Leadership kept declaring various projects and initiatives as mission-critical, creating a culture where everything was urgent but nothing felt particularly meaningful. The company brought Brown in to help with what they thought was a stress management problem, but her assessment revealed something deeper. Through interviews with employees at all levels, Brown discovered that while everyone could recite the company's official mission statement, very few could articulate how their specific role contributed to that mission, or why the mission mattered to them personally. The leadership team implemented Brown's mission clarity framework, which involved three key elements. First, leaders had to get genuine clarity about their own connection to the company's purpose. Second, they had to help each team member understand how their role created value for customers and communities. Third, they had to regularly connect daily work to larger purpose through storytelling and reflection. Within 6 months, employee engagement scores increased by 55%, turnover dropped by 40%, and productivity improved significantly, not because people were working harder, but because they understood why their work mattered. This wasn't luck. It was the application of Brown's mission clarity methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests developing what she calls personal mission architecture, getting crystal clear about your own purpose and values, then consciously connecting your daily activities to that larger sense of meaning. This involves 3 levels of clarity. First, understanding your core values and how they translate into action. Second, identifying how your current role or responsibilities contribute to something meaningful beyond yourself. Third, regularly reflecting on and sharing stories about when you've experienced the satisfaction of purpose-driven work. The key is moving from abstract mission statements to concrete, personal understanding of why your work matters. Brown warns against what she calls mission statement theater, creating impressive-sounding purpose statements that sound good in presentations, but don't actually guide decision-making or inspire daily behavior. She also cautions against purpose bypassing, using lofty mission language to avoid addressing practical problems or difficult conversations. Instead, focus on what she calls lived mission, purpose that shows up in how you treat people, make decisions, and prioritize your time and energy. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the daily purpose connection. Each morning, identify one specific way your planned activities that day connect to your larger sense of purpose. Each evening, reflect on moments when you felt most connected to meaningful work and moments when you felt disconnected from purpose. The deeper truth here is that mission clarity isn't about finding the perfect mission statement. It's about cultivating an ongoing relationship with meaning that evolves as you grow and as circumstances change. When you develop this kind of purpose consciousness, you don't just become more motivated and resilient. You become more inspiring to others, because people can sense when someone is connected to something larger than themselves. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that leadership is ultimately about helping others connect with their own sense of purpose and agency. People who master mission clarity experience what researchers call meaningful work engagement, a deep satisfaction that comes from knowing their efforts matter and contribute to something they value. As the research in Strong Ground shows, individuals with high mission clarity are 60% more likely to report high job satisfaction and 45% more likely to stay with their organizations long-term. Your action step from this chapter: complete your own personal mission architecture this week. First, write down your top 3 core values and give a specific example of each value in action. Second, describe how your current work or main responsibilities contribute to something meaningful beyond personal benefit. Third, identify one story from your experience when you felt most connected to purposeful work. Share this story with someone you trust and notice how articulating your sense of purpose affects your motivation and clarity. This exercise builds what Brown calls your purpose muscle, leading to greater fulfillment and more inspiring leadership. Chapter 9, Between Stimulus and Response, the Space Where Leadership Lives. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown explores what she considers the most crucial space in leadership development, the gap between stimulus and response. Drawing from Viktor Frankl's famous insight that, between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. Brown reveals how expanding this space is the key to moving from reactive leadership to responsive, conscious leadership that serves both people and purpose. Brown's research over 2 decades studying emotional intelligence and leadership effectiveness revealed a fundamental truth. The difference between leaders who consistently bring out the best in others and those who create cultures of fear or dysfunction isn't talent, charisma, or even technical competence. It's the capacity to pause between feeling something and acting on that feeling. The problem most people face is that our brains are wired for speed and efficiency, which means we often react automatically to triggers without conscious choice. But Brown's breakthrough insight shows that the most effective leaders are those who have trained themselves to recognize this crucial moment of choice and use it to respond from their values rather than their impulses. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive work with leaders across industries. Those who consistently demonstrate what she calls conscious leadership have developed what she terms responsibility, not just the ability to respond, but the capacity to choose their response based on what the situation requires rather than what their automatic patterns would dictate. This challenges the common belief that good leadership is about quick decision-making and decisive action. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that the most powerful leadership often happens in the pause, the moment when you feel triggered but choose to breathe, reflect, and respond from your highest self rather than your reactive patterns. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, the space between stimulus and response is where our humanity lives, where our values become visible, and where we either perpetuate old patterns or create new possibilities. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of Jennifer, a department head who prided herself on being decisive and action-oriented. But Jennifer had a pattern of responding to challenging news or criticism with immediate problem-solving mode that often left her team members feeling unheard and steamrolled. This came to a head when one of her best employees submitted a resignation, citing feeling invisible despite Jennifer's belief that she was being supportive. Jennifer learned about Brown's stimulus response space framework during a leadership development program and began practicing what Brown calls the sacred pause. When she received challenging information or felt triggered by criticism, instead of immediately jumping into fix-it mode, she trained herself to take 3 conscious breaths and ask, "What does this person need from me right now? What would my best self do in this situation?" The transformation was remarkable. Jennifer discovered that often what people needed wasn't immediate solutions, but to be heard, understood, and supported as they worked through challenges themselves. Her team began bringing her problems earlier, collaboration improved dramatically, and the employee who had been planning to leave decided to stay. This wasn't luck, it was the application of Brown's conscious response methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests developing what she calls pause practice, training yourself to recognize your personal triggers and create space between the trigger and your response. This involves first becoming aware of your common reaction patterns. Do you tend to go into problem-solving mode when people share problems? Do you get defensive when receiving feedback? Do you shut down when feeling overwhelmed? Once you know your patterns, you can practice what Brown calls the conscious pause, taking 3 breaths, asking yourself what this situation needs from your best self, and then choosing your response accordingly. Brown warns against what she calls reaction addiction, the habit of responding immediately to every stimulus because it feels productive or decisive, even when it's not actually helpful. She also cautions against pause paralysis, becoming so focused on not reacting that you fail to respond at all when action is needed. Instead, focus on what she calls conscious responsiveness, using the pause to choose responses that align with your values and serve the situation rather than just relieve your own discomfort. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the Sacred Pause Protocol. When you notice yourself having a strong emotional reaction, pause and ask 3 questions. 1. What am I feeling right now? 2. What does this situation need? 3. How can I respond from my best self? The deeper truth here is that the space between stimulus and response isn't just about better communication or conflict resolution. It's about claiming your power as a conscious human being who can choose responses based on values and wisdom rather than just impulses and conditioning. When you develop this capacity, you don't just become a better leader. You become more trustworthy, more present, and more able to bring out the best in others because you're consistently showing up from your highest self. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that leadership is ultimately about consciousness and choice. The ability to recognize that you always have options about how to respond to any situation, even when the options are difficult. People who master the stimulus-response space experience what researchers call emotional regulation and behavioral flexibility, the ability to manage their own emotional states and adapt their responses to serve different situations and people effectively. As the research in Strong Ground shows, leaders with high stimulus-response awareness have teams with 50% fewer conflicts and 40% higher psychological safety scores. Your action step from this chapter: practice the Sacred Pause Protocol for the next week. Identify one common trigger or challenging situation you face regularly, perhaps receiving criticism, dealing with interruptions, or hearing about problems. When this trigger occurs, commit to taking 3 conscious breaths before responding and asking yourself the 3 protocol questions. Notice how this pause affects both your internal experience and the quality of your interactions. Track how often you remember to pause versus reacting automatically. This practice builds what Brown calls your conscious response muscle, leading to more intentional leadership and stronger relationships. Chapter 10. The Wisdom of the Human Spirit, Leading with Heart and Grit. In Strong Ground, Brené Brown concludes with what she considers the ultimate leadership paradox. The wisdom of the human spirit lies in our ability to be both tender and fierce, vulnerable and strong, humble and confident. Through her work with over 150,000 leaders globally, Brown discovered that the most effective leaders aren't those who master one style or approach, but those who develop what she calls full-spectrum humanity, the capacity to access different aspects of themselves depending on what each situation requires. Brown's research over 2 decades, studying courage, resilience, and authentic leadership, revealed a pattern that challenges conventional thinking about leadership development. The leaders who had the greatest positive impact weren't those who fit traditional leadership archetypes or who had eliminated their weaknesses, but those who had learned to integrate seemingly opposite qualities into a coherent, authentic whole. The problem most people face is the cultural pressure to choose between being seen as strong or caring, decisive or collaborative, confident or humble. But Brown's breakthrough insight shows that this either-or thinking actually limits our effectiveness and authenticity as leaders. Here's what Brown discovered through her extensive research. The leaders who thrived in complex, challenging environments had developed what she calls paradoxical integration, the ability to hold multiple, seemingly contradictory capacities simultaneously. They could be compassionate without being permissive, hold people accountable without being harsh, stay optimistic while acknowledging difficult realities, and maintain high standards while showing grace for human imperfection. This challenges the common belief that effective leadership requires choosing a style and sticking with it consistently. Instead, Brown's contrarian insight reveals that the most versatile and trustworthy leaders are those who can access their full range of human capacities in service of their people and their mission. As Brown puts it in Strong Ground, the wisdom of the human spirit isn't about being perfect or even consistent. It's about being whole, which means having access to all parts of yourself and the wisdom to know when each part is needed. Let me give you a real example from the book. Brown shares the story of Robert, a CEO who had built his reputation on being tough, no-nonsense, and results-driven. This approach had served him well in turning around struggling companies, but he was now leading a successful organization through a period of growth that required more collaboration, innovation, and employee engagement. His traditional command and control style was creating resistance and stifling the creativity the company needed. Robert initially resisted the idea that he needed to change his leadership approach, fearing that showing more vulnerability or empathy would undermine his authority. But through Brown's coaching process, he learned about paradoxical integration, the idea that he could maintain his strength and high standards while also being more emotionally available and collaborative. Robert began experimenting with what Brown calls strong back, soft front, wild heart leadership, staying grounded in his values and standards, strong back, remaining open and curious about others' perspectives, soft front, and maintaining passion and authenticity, wild heart. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Employee engagement increased dramatically, innovation flourished, and the company achieved its best financial performance ever. Robert later said he felt more authentic and energized as a leader than he had in years. This wasn't luck. It was the application of Brown's integrated leadership methodology. Here's how you can apply this in your own life. Brown suggests developing what she calls leadership range, consciously expanding your capacity to access different aspects of yourself, depending on what each situation requires. This involves first identifying your natural leadership strengths and then exploring the complementary qualities that would make you even more effective. If you're naturally collaborative, practice making tough decisions quickly when needed. If you're naturally decisive, practice creating more space for others' input. The key is understanding that developing range doesn't mean abandoning your strengths, it means expanding them. Brown warns against what she calls leadership costume wearing, trying to be someone you're not rather than expanding who you authentically are. She also cautions against authenticity as excuse, using "this is just who I am" to avoid growing or developing new capacities. Instead, focus on what she calls evolutionary authenticity, staying true to your core values while continuously expanding your ability to serve others effectively. One practical tool from Strong Ground is the Leadership Stretch Assessment. Identify one situation where you tend to default to the same response. Then experiment with accessing a different aspect of yourself while maintaining your core values and integrity. The deeper truth here is that the wisdom of the human spirit isn't about achieving some perfect state of enlightened leadership. It's about embracing the beautiful complexity of being human while taking responsibility for continuing to grow in service of something larger than yourself. When you develop this kind of integrated leadership presence, you don't just become more effective, you become more inspiring, because people can sense when someone is bringing their whole self to their work rather than performing a role. This connects to Brown's broader philosophy that leadership is ultimately about modeling what it looks like to be courageously human, to be imperfect but growing, strong but humble, confident but curious. People who master paradoxical integration experience what researchers call authentic leadership and adaptive expertise, the ability to remain true to themselves while flexibly meeting the changing needs of their people and situations. As the research in Strong Ground shows, leaders with high paradoxical integration have the highest trust ratings from their teams and are most likely to be described as both tough and caring by those who work with them. Your action step from this chapter: complete a leadership range assessment this week. First, identify your top 3 natural leadership strengths, the qualities people most often recognize and appreciate about your leadership. Then, for each strength, identify one complementary quality that would make you even more effective. For example, if you're naturally supportive, the complement might be willing to have difficult conversations. Choose one complementary quality to practice this week, looking for opportunities to stretch beyond your comfort zone while staying true to your values. Notice how expanding your range affects both your effectiveness and your sense of authenticity as a leader. Conclusion. Over the past few minutes, we've journeyed through Brené Brown's groundbreaking research in Strong Ground, a book that represents the culmination of 6 years working with over 150,000 leaders across 45 countries and 2 decades studying courage, vulnerability, and human connection. Let's recap the 10 key insights that can transform how you lead in life. We explored the power of holding paradox rather than collapsing into either or thinking. We discovered grounded confidence, that athletic stance that keeps you centered yet agile. We learned to lead with curiosity rather than false certainty, choosing questions over quick answers. We practiced operating above the line, from learning rather than self-protection. We developed pocket presence, recognizing that leadership happens in micro moments throughout each day. We built lock-in and lock-through power to sustain courage under pressure. We understood the anatomy of transformation and how to lead change that actually lasts. We moved from mission-critical urgency to mission-clarity meaning. We learn to expand the space between stimulus and response, choosing conscious responses over automatic reactions. And finally, we embrace the wisdom of integrating our full humanity, being both tender and fierce, humble and confident. Brown's research shows us that leadership in our complex world isn't about having all the answers or projecting invulnerability. It's about developing the courage to stay connected to what matters most, while remaining curious, compassionate, and committed to growth. Most importantly, strong ground reveals that the challenges we face as leaders aren't obstacles to overcome, but invitations to develop capacities we didn't know we needed. Here's what I want you to remember from strong ground. Your struggles with uncertainty, your moments of doubt, your experiences of failure, these aren't signs that you're not cut out for leadership. They're the raw material for developing the kind of grounded, authentic leadership our world desperately needs. Your willingness to be vulnerable isn't a weakness to hide, but a superpower to cultivate. The practices Brown outlines, from paradox tolerance to conscious responding to mission clarity, these aren't one-time activities. They're lifelong commitments to showing up as your most courageous, connected self even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. Start small. Choose one concept from today that resonated most deeply with you. Practice it consistently for the next week. Remember what Brown discovered through all her research. Courage is contagious, authenticity creates safety for others, and leading from strong ground doesn't just change you, it changes everyone around you. By applying the principles in strong ground, you're not just becoming a better leader, you're participating in what Brown calls a quiet revolution of people who are choosing courage over comfort, accountability over blame, and connection over isolation. Your journey from strong ground starts now. The world is waiting for the leader you're becoming.